we've got 3 new members we'd like to welcome tonight. Alan Black is with us. Al Whitney hasn't joined us yet, and Sheila Nathanson from up in Pittsburgh hasn't joined us yet, but hopefully they will show up. We've got some out-of-staters. We've got Deb from New Jersey. We've got Alan from Virginia, and later on we will probably end up with Sheila from Pennsylvania. So we've got lots of new members from all over the place. We hate that we had to cancel the May events. We miss seeing everybody in person. It's nothing quite like being able to talk and yak it up when we're together and looking at pretty plants, but hopefully in June, cross our fingers, God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll be able to get together in June. We're gonna have 2 Zoom meetings this month, tonight's show table meeting, and we're gonna also try to have a scare table where we, if you have problem plants or plants that you have questions about, send in pictures and we'll see if we can do a problem plant clinic. So that'll be on the 19th. So, and we'll need pictures by the 12th of this month to be able to pull the presentation together. So without further ado, we have the great Courtney Hackney, who's ready to tell us some bedtime stories.
That's scary every time you say that, Sue. Well, as usual, the club members just overextended themselves and sent in so many nice photos. It was really great the way you were able to make a selection, Sue. I'm glad you did it, because it's really difficult for me to pick out favorites unless we want to spend a couple hours here. And much as I know everyone loves their orchids and their photos, I have a feeling that would be a little long. So Terry, are you ready for the?
Yeah, let's see. Let me get shared here.
There we go. That's kind of good having a new member send in photographs. But you know, for those of you that know our new member, I can't really see the right part of my screen, but I think if there's going to be an intervention for him, this is the time to get him before he gets too deep into this thing. But I love the containers he's got his plants in. Beautiful colors too. Next slide, Terry. There's a great selection of species. It's hard to know where to stop on some of these. The Cattleya clandii, that really is a good example of how this particular species loves to grow. In fact, I'm very impressed that Sue's got any bulbs in the pot whatsoever. I mean, my plant doesn't have a single bulb in the pot. They're all around the sides and the bottom, but the more they grow on the pot, the better they flower. And it's not uncommon for these to flower several times during the summer, particularly once you get a really nice sized plant like this. Where'd the other photos go, Terry?
There we go.
There we are. Cattleya violacea is a plant that a lot of people have a difficult time growing. This is one, I think maybe Sue, did you get this from Fred Clark?
Yes.
Yeah, he made a cross of 2 different forms, basically with white backgrounds and colored petals and sepals, and produced an array of colors. And what's fascinating about this particular cross that he made, look at the variation on the flowers on the inflorescence on the right. See, there's much less of the coloring. And I've noticed that on my clone because I have one from him as well. Basically, this was a striata by a flammea, and the striata have these little stripes, and the flammea is sort of a solid color. And I've seen some of the individuals from this cross that were true flammeas, but most of them are just like this one with this really fascinating color form. If you've tried to grow violacea and had trouble, the issue really is the winter temperature. They do not like cold in the winter. And once I started hanging mine over my heaters during the wintertime, I never had any dieback, and they just take right off in the spring. It's really well grown, Sue. I'm proud of you not keeping that plant in the pot. How about the next violacea? There's another one. Okay, that one right there. This is Steve's clone, and you can see this is a true flammea. I don't think it came from the same Grex, but there are so many of these out there now of once a very, very rare form. The normal color is a pink, and the whites came along as semi-albas. I remember seeing them for $500 a bulb at one time. You can get them basically the price for a regular species now. But they come in an array of semi-alba forms, solid petals, and you can still see there's some striata in the sepals on this. It's hard to get a pure white with just a solid dark magenta on the petals. This is beautiful. Look at the lip on this thing, just magnificent. Okay, go to the next one on there. This is Skinneri. It's a spring bloomer. All of mine have been finished for a month or so, but it's not uncommon for them to bloom for several months. And you get an idea of why this is such a popular species. It grows really well, grows fast. It can take the heat. Everything you'd want in an orchid, particularly if you were happy neglecting them. They do well in baskets. That's the only complaint most people have, is that they outgrow the pots very fast. Typically, there's quite a difference between each new growth, so they tend to wander out of pots fast. So basket's a great place for these guys. But that's really well grown. That's Tom and Dottie's plant. Next. Oh, almost, okay. This is the next slide. There's two intermedia albas here, and they each have an interesting story. The intermedia alba lines has got an FCC, but it turns out there were several of these FCCs that actually aren't intermedia, they're hybrids. And when you see the plant and you see the size of the flowers, you recognize how different they are from the one at the bottom, which is intermedia alba, and that's Breckenridge Snow. Mark Rose told me that's a wild collected plant. And it is more typical. It grows like an intermedia. The flowers have all the botanical characteristics that you would expect. And then Francisco Miranda told me there was a whole swarm of the intermedia albas awarded highly that were not intermedia, but they're beautiful, and they've been used several times by major hybridizers in making crosses, and they do really well as a parent, as long as you understand that you're going to get very large plants out of a cross with them. On the right is, upper right is Cattleya amethysta glossa. It is a spectacular species, and there can be as many as 15 to 20 flowers on a stem. This is a really nice one, just looking at the flowers. Beautiful pink background with all of the heavy spotting, and that's sort of the ideal. There are a couple of variations on the theme, including a cerulean, but this is really nice. And the issue is growing them. You don't see a lot of these come to the show tables, largely because people don't grow them well, mostly because they repot at the wrong time. It's really difficult to repot a large plant like this at the same time that new roots are coming out, but that's when you have to do it. You really don't ever repot Amethysta glossa without new roots. In fact, my advice is don't ever repot it. They don't like to be repotted, and the people I've seen who grow these really well, often you'll see a plant out of a pot with 2 or 3 growths, and sitting right next to the plant under the new growths coming out of the pot is a new pot. And growers will just let them grow into the new pot, put the roots down in the new pot, and have 3 or 4 growths in the new pot before they cut the rhizome. If you have new roots like that, you'll never lose a plant. They do like to be drier in the wintertime. So if you had trouble and you know how to grow these and you've been doing everything right, it may be that you're keeping a little too wet in the winter. They are a warm growing species, and they'll take as much heat as you throw at them. What else do we have on there, Terry? Is that the last one? Oh, no. This is beautiful. It's a good example, too, of what happens when you have a species in the background that is so dominant. And the Clandii is in the background. So the Clandii that you saw Sue's plant earlier, if you just look at this particular hybrid, you can see a Clandii all over it. It's got multiple doses of a Clandii. And these are almost all fairly small growing species. They don't get really large. And the only downside to it is that they like to grow like a clandii. They'll grow on the outside of the pot. They like really coarse media, and they don't like to be repotted. If you can avoid repotting, you'll get a lot of flowers. And again, they can flower multiple times a year, mostly through the summer, late spring into the summer. Next. This is, well, was called Potnara sedona's golden rainforest. Now we would simply call this a Cattleya, but it's useful to think about what's in the background. Laelia tenebrosa is one of the parents of this. And every time you use Laelia tenebrosa to make a hybrid, you are almost guaranteed to see this beautiful lip. The lip is just a characteristic of that species that is almost always dominant, that big round lip. What is fascinating about it is on orchid, I looked at the hybrid, and the variation in the petals and sepals of its siblings is remarkable. Everything from yellows, clear colors, etc. And this one I like because of all the veining. That veining is an interesting trait that isn't really something that hybridizers have worked on over the years, but it exists in several species in the Cattleya group, and often comes out in hybrids just like this, here and there, one here, one there. But hybridizers have never really spent time trying to focus on it. But it really is beautiful. It's really nice.
Really nice.
That's a pretty one. Next. One of my loves has always been encyclias. And we've got some nice examples here of the species and the hybrids. And at one time, encyclia and epidendrum were considered the same group. And all of us that have grown them always knew they were separate. Now they're clearly separated. Encyclia cordigera is a beautiful species. It used to go by a different name. So if you've got something that looks like this, but it's got a different name, it's probably cordigera. You can put cordigera on your tag, but keep the old one. Who knows what taxonomists might decide in the future. They may change and go back to the original name, or they may separate the species. And one of the interesting things about this group is that the hybrid on the bottom right is actually a cordigera hybrid. So it's orange nugget by cordigera, and it also illustrates a really important piece of information if you're trying to hybridize encyclias, and that is they dominate for form. Always the shape of the encyclia dominates a hybrid, and it's hard to get that shape away from a hybrid. So if you want something big and round like standard Cattleya, you don't mix encyclia with it. But Epilalia Cattleya Golden Sunburst is a really interesting example of what can be done. This is an Encyclia rufa cross, which is a Bahamian species I've seen growing in the wild, and it has a number of forms of that species that are yellow or green. And rufa has a downside, is that the flowers kind of fold forward. In this particular hybrid, the hybridizer has done a good job of sort of masking that characteristic by adding gold digger, which is a species that comes through Cattleya aurantiaca. I guess it's Guaranthia aurantiaca now, but it tends to put the color in its hybrids and dominate. And in this case, the thing that's most surprising is how flat the flowers are. But this is really beautiful. I'd swear I'd seen this in Sue's greenhouse before. But this is Marianne Bell, I think, isn't it? I can't quite see that.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nicely grown. Look at the number of flowers on a stem. And that is one of the characteristics of the encyclias that is very useful in a hybrid, is the high flower count. Maybe the only downside is you tend to rarely get more than one flowering a year. But as the plant gets larger, they can have inflorescences that open a month before some of the others. So they can have a long flowering season. There's one other on that slide there, Terry. Oh, two. Yeah, this one here, Brassoepidendrum green dragon. This is really interesting. This is Brassavola nodosa by Epidendrum, what we used to call Canopsium or Magnoliae now, which is the little thing growing out in the swamps around here. In fact, it grows all the way up into North Carolina. It's the northernmost species that grows attached to other trees, other rocks, but it mostly is in trees, but I have seen it on rocks here in Florida, down in South Florida. What's most interesting is the species actually extends across the Gulf Coast. And in Mexico, there is a species that used to be considered the same. Some taxonomists now consider it the true Canopsium, and this one from Florida, the Magnoliae. But what I've noticed is the Mexican species is really much easier to grow than the Florida one, despite the fact that we live in Florida, and has higher flower count. So this one is, in fact, I was surprised when I saw 4 flowers on this, because that's about the most I've ever seen of this hybrid, but it looks like it's just getting cranked up. So maybe we'll get to see high flower counts on this individual clone as it gets bigger and bigger. The epidendrum is a classic example of an epidendrum. It's one of the first ones that I ever saw, first orchids I ever saw outside of the ones that grew outside my house. And I didn't even know it was an epidendrum at the time. In Hawaii, there are a lot of places where this has escaped and grows along the ditches along the road. But in South America, it is a ditch species. You see it growing all around the roads, especially in certain elevations. Sometimes they're different species. This is radicans, but it's a classic epidendrum with relatively tall growths, and then these masses of flowers, and they will stay in flower almost all year long. I've seen hedges of these in South Florida too, where people are literally growing them as a hedge. It's really nice. I'm actually a little worried about this particular species because this is the only plant that my wife has ever bought of an orchid without me there. And it's growing in our back deck, and it's got seed pods everywhere. So I'm hoping we haven't introduced a species out there that isn't supposed to be here. Theoretically, they can't take the cold, but orchids surprise you a lot of times. Now, that's Yamanata Redland Sunset. That's the one that is the Cordigera hybrid. And again, the shape gives it away. What's striking about it is that the contrast of color between the lip, which comes from the Cordigera, and the petal colors, which is coming from the other parent. The orange nugget is the species, the hybrid in the background. Next slide. Well, there's your Laelia purpurata, Sue.
Yes.
It is Laelia purpurata season. I always think of May as the season for Laelia purpurata. If you don't know the story about Laelia purpurata, it's remarkable in that it grows originally it grew right along the ocean side. So the first people getting to South America, this is one of the first things they saw. And the growers in South America have identified more than 150 different cultivars from the wild. And I don't know how many cultivars that they've got now of different color forms that they've made through hybridizing. But this is a beautiful, I guess this is a rubriform. This was at one time highly sought after to make hybrids for a whole lot of reasons, basically the colors. And the problem that first hybridizers ran into is that while it produces a lot of flowers, so cut flowers, that might be real good, what they didn't realize is if you make a hybrid with it, it takes a lot longer for them to bloom. And a lot of the first hybrids made with it were thrown away before they ever bloomed, because the hybridizers thought they should have bloomed by the end of the seventh year. Some of them didn't bloom till the 10th year. So many of the plants were thrown away before they ever flowered. This is still one of my favorite species. It's hiding in the background of a lot of our modern Cattleyas, but it has some real downsides in hybridizing. Look at the petals on this particular species, this clone, and this is a good clone. The petals tend to be pinched, and they pass that characteristics on multiple generations. Some of the I won't call them hybrids, but some of the line-bred Laelia purpuratas that come out of Brazil now don't have this, but it's taken 5 to 10 generations to get it out, even if you had the best of the species from the wild. But that's really beautiful. What else we got on that page, Terry? We got some beautiful things. The Momolati Rainbow. This is a clone called the Gypsy, J. Fowler's. And this is a remarkable hybrid. Originally, almost all of the ones that I saw looked very much like this one, with different shades of of pink in the background, but all with this perfect splash. Look at the lip and look at the colors on the petals, and you see it's a perfect mimic. The only thing it lacks is the reproductive organs. Uh, Many years ago, I found a compote of two awarded ones crossed together, so they'd still be Momolani rainbow. I think I bloomed 12 out of it, and 10 of the 12 were awardable. They were so good. It was such a consistent hybrid that it's just sieving that made really good ones. It's hard to find any kind of a hybrid for which that will happen. But every year when they bloom, they're just striking. Heads of flowers. Sometimes there's more peach in the background. And this is an interesting hybrid too, because depending on the temperature and probably some other things like nutrients, you can get variations of color on different inflorescences on the same plant, which makes it an interesting hybrid. Judging doesn't like that, but from a standpoint of having a lot of different colors on one plant, that's kind of a nice thing. Now, above that is a really old classic. This is Mount Hood Orchid Glade. These are monster flowers. This is Jay Fowler's plant. They're monster flowers. For years, I've searched for a virus-free clone of this and couldn't find one until maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I got one that has not tested positive. But even the ones that test positive have the Cymbidium mosaic. So you can't see it in the flower. And it doesn't seem to detract from the vigor of the plant at all. These plants are large and they produce large flowers and they're very easy to grow. I suspect that's why this is still one of the best ones around. It's an interesting hybrid from the background standpoint that I can spend probably 50 minutes talking about. But it's one of those things that came from the early hybridizers, mixing the big Brasso hybrids with big whites and producing just magnificent pinks. It's still one of my favorite old-fashioned Cattleyas. Next slide.
Oh,
What happened? Brassicatlia and Mary Dodson. I'll bet you that almost everyone who's heard me over a few months would be able to guess what's in the background of both of these clones. And that's Brassivola nodosa. It just is such a dominant species. And in this case, it's dominating two very different kinds of mates. For instance, the one on the left is Cattleya schilleriana by Brassivola nodosa. And schilleriana is known for being extremely dominant. It's related really to a clandii. And you can see that this still takes after the nodosa in shape. And all the color that you see in the lip, that's mostly coming from the nodosa, although the striping is a characteristic that you often see in the schilleriana too. Just really, really interesting flower. And again, if you saw this, you would be able to guess the nodosa as one parent right away. Now, the other one in there is a Brassivola nodosa hybrid too. And the other parent is one of the hollow bulbed Schomburgkias, which we now call Myricophila. And they are also extraordinarily dominant when you cross them with anything. But in this case, the Thomsoniana, which is the Myricophila parent, which is yellow. The yellow color comes through on the petals. And maybe there's a little bit of twisting of the petals that's characteristic of the Schomburgkia. And but you can see the lip is all just spotted, and that's all coming from nodosa. Even the petals have some spotting, again from the nodosa. It's a really pretty hybrid. I never thought of doing those two together, but that's a neat cross. Next slide. Stanhopea Lydia Bush. Sue has miracle touch when it comes to Stanhopeas. That is just magnificent. This is one of those ones that the picture is really beautiful, but if this were on the show table, you'd be awestruck by how spectacular it is. And the only downside to Stanhopeas that I could think of is the flowers don't last long, but the plant will keep flowering. It'll keep sending out new inflorescences for some time during the summertime.
That one has had 8 blooms on it this year.
Wow.
It
Yeah,
smells great.
Yeah, the smell is incredible. That's one of the things that you would notice if you were close to it. Next. I thought we should have some paths represented here. And the one on the left, Paphiopedilum Bell Royale, fortunately I caught this one, it was under the bench before it grew up. The spike came up through the bench, so I was able to get the flowers to open. But it's a hybrid between 2 species. And the species, one of them is called Colapagingii, which is the largest plant in the Paph family of the species. A well-grown plant it'll stretch a meter across in the leaf span. So it's beautiful, beautiful thing. And the other is one of the very large paths. And these are called multifloras. And you can see why. There's 1, 2, 3, there's 5 on the Bell Royale. And they'll last 3 or 4 weeks often, particularly if you start counting when the first flower opens, because the first flower on this thing opened in March sometime, and it's May, and it's still got 4 flowers on it. They're very easy to grow in Florida. They like the heat. That's the best part about it. They don't care at all whether it's hot. They're not crazy about the super cold, but they'll do well in it. And I inserted this one so you could see. This is the plant in the pot. It's being grown in lava rock. You can't really see the bottom, but I wanted to tell you something because I know several of you have told me you were going to try that. In the bottom of the pot are large lava rocks as well as some limestone chunks from my driveway, the old driveway. But the trick is, you can see on the right there, that's the old growth from last year. And one of the things that happens that I have discovered in lava rock, because you don't have to ever repot them, is the old roots will eventually rot. And I used to just leave them there and not worry about it, but they can add too much acidity as they rot. So as the plant grows, when this finishes flowering, that old growth to the right, just a bunch of roots, I'll pull that out to the extent that they'll all come out and replace it with fresh lava rock. That way it'll stay in this pot another 5 or 6 years. Now the other multiflora there is a species. This is Paph philippinense. It's also a multiflora. And this is the form Robelinii. If you've had this species and it didn't look like this, it's because the species itself doesn't have these long petals. They're about half the length and not all twisted like this. You can see in this particular form that it's pretty closely related to Sanderiana, which has the petals that can stretch down 30 inches or more. It's kind of a very interesting species, and I think I still love the Paph species more than the hybrids, although I do have some hybrids. And this one I don't grow under the bench. As I said, this is one of my favorites. So this actually grows up with right underneath my vandas hanging, and they really love the high light. If you really want a lot of flowers, and this has got 1, 2, 3, 4. I think this had 5 flowers, or 6. If you want these to grow and flower well, they do like high light. I'm sure that Bell Royale would have more flowers if I subjected it to more light too. Okay, next slide. Frags became real popular just a few years ago when some of the bright colored frags came along. They started to mix them and match them. This is Frag Umbriel, and you can see it is a typical pouch orchid. It looks very much like a Paph, and it is essentially a South American Paph. The real difference in them in terms of culture is that while most of the Paphs come from areas where they grow on limestone, pretty good portion of them like to grow in limestone. The frags are exactly the opposite. They need really high quality water, and they don't need to grow in limestone. And many of them do not like the heat. Many of them grow best if you can keep the temperature 80 or under. And some of the people who grow them really well in North Carolina, where it gets really hot in the summertime, They have a little system where they run refrigerated water through the roots. They don't have to air condition them. They just have to keep the roots cool. In the wild, a lot of times these grow in the sides of uh, cliff faces where water is running down, cold water in the high elevations, and that is what they love. And these are no exceptions. These are some of the types that we used to have in the early years with the beautiful green coloration and the amber colored pouch. Really pretty. And you can see these are sequential bloomers. You can see one bloom there and it's got another bud coming, and they'll bloom for quite a long time. Just one flower will drop and then another one will open. Most of the time, about the most flowers you have on an individual stem open at a time is 2. Next. Dendrobiums. I never cease to be amazed at the dendrobiums that our members grow and grow extremely well. Dendrobium nestor is a really interesting one. It's a primary cross of Parishii bananosium, and that cross was originally made in 1892. So this is an old hybrid. Now, obviously, I think obviously these plants weren't from that 1892 hybrid, but the cross has been made multiple times by modern hybridizers using even better parents than existed at the time. And that's been made and remade just because it's such a beautiful hybrid, but a really nice example. And you also see 2 examples of culture. One's a little smaller plant where the inflorescences are sort of in the center. The other's a little older plant where the newer inflorescences are more on the outside. But both very well grown and very well flowered. Dendrobium unicum. This is Leslie's, and every time I see one of these, I walk over and look at it, even though I know what it is before I even get there, because it's such a striking orange color, and just a beautiful example of one of the species that we never used to see. These just weren't in culture 30 or 40 years ago. The one on the middle, Dendrobium thailandia, I think that's Thailandica. I think Sue said she couldn't find, and I can't find either. It may be a newly described species, or this may be a name that is not recognized and there's a synonym, but I could not find another one that looked anything like this. So I suspect in the near future on OrchidWiz, we'll look and we'll find Thailandica. But again, very well grown. And you can see this is a really miniature, tiny plant relative to some of the other dendrobiums that we're used to talking about. And just the cutest little flowers. Just really beautiful. And again, well grown by Leslie. Next slide. Do we have any more? Oh, here we go. Oncidium pumilum. I wonder how many things Linda has to put her plants in. And we see new ones every single time, and that is just gorgeous. I sat there and looked at that, and I have to admit the only bad thing was I was just entranced by the container it's in. But it's a beautiful, beautiful species and very, very well grown and well displayed. Couldn't ask for anything better. What else we got on there, Terry? We got some. Give me that big yellow spathoglottum. Yeah, there it is. You can see how big this plant is. This is Ricky Torres's plant. And these are magnificent when grown well, and this is grown well. But I will tell you, in places where they do not have winter and need greenhouses, the size of some of these plants is such that you couldn't ever get them to a show. There was a show in March many years ago in Raleigh, and a grower from South Florida, Homestead, brought a U-Haul, and virtually the only thing in the U-Haul truck was a specimen of Spathoglottum. And it must have been 6 by 8 in terms of sitting in that truck, and it filled a 50-foot exhibit. They had almost no room for anything else. But it's just striking. I was surprised. We had a neighbor move in a couple houses down. They were here for a year, and they had one of these hanging in a tree outside. It was there all year long. It bloomed. It wasn't bothered by the the 30 degrees that happened that year. I couldn't believe it didn't get burned, but they can handle apparently quite a bit of cold. And the growers in South Florida, as I said, it never is bothered by any cold that they get. The photo on the right, we used to call this Colmanara, but it is no longer considered a Colmanara. It's now in a new taxonomy. It's just an Oncidium. And it's got the speculatum, I can never say that. It's got that word in the background too. And you can almost see why the hybridizer integrated that species into this hybrid line. Look at the number of flowers, and what they added to that hybrid line was a species that branched nice and neatly. It's a characteristic of the Colmanara to have that beautiful branching habit. This is a really nice one and extremely well grown.
Courtney, Steve made that cross himself when he was at Rod McClellan.
Ah, neat. That's
Yeah.
really a good story.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful cross. Next slide. Tolumnias, they're some of my favorites. At one time I had over 100 of a single species. And there's a story about the hybrids that will take more than the time we have. But the Tolumnia guineensis on the left is a good example of some of the characteristics in this particular genus. And if you look carefully at these flowers, you'll see this particular species has very, very large petals. It's got a big lip and big, big petals. And the plant is pretty tiny. And the downside to this particular species is the very long inflorescence. And so hybridizers have used this species extensively to get the big petals onto the hybrids. And they had to play a game, because if you get too much of this species in the background, you get these very long inflorescences. So you can look at the two Tolumnias to the right, and you can see pretty large petals. And I'll guarantee you, when you look into the background of these particular hybrids, you'll see the guineensis in the background, and that is one of the things it contributes, is those beautiful petals. Rumnia, trying to think what we used to call these, but they're basically nothing more than Rodriguezii, which is a closely related group to the Tolumnias, integrated into Tolumnia many generations back. And one of the things they add to the hybrid line is a little bit larger plants. The plants tend to be a little bigger with Rumnia in there, Rodriguezii in the background. But a lot of the other characteristics of that genus are gone, and mostly what you have in there is Tolumnia. This is a beautiful little example of a Tolumnia. Perfect Heart by Peekaboo, being grown well by Janice. And then we have another Rodriguezii. Can't quite see the whole thing, but that's got this beautiful pink, it's got this beautiful pink lip, and hybridizers have essentially used a species called Tolumnia pulchellum, which has this beautiful pink, big pink lip, and they've incorporated that into the hybrid line. And you can see how nicely they've added it, because now that lip often comes around and folds over the petals, making a nice round shape, which is what the hybridizers and judges are looking for. Next slide. We're going to have B just bring this photo every single month, so we can demonstrate how continuous flowered this Psychopsis Mendenhall is. But again, these are sequential bloomers. The inflorescence will last for a long, long time. And if you look carefully at the plant, you can see the plant's really pretty too. They have these little spotted leaves, at least Mendenhall does, and some of the species do, that make it an attractive plant as well. Just don't cut those inflorescences off till they turn brown. Psychopsis papilio is one of the species in the background. Just beautiful example of the butterfly orchid. A lot of people think they're very hard to grow. I think you need to talk to B and J to be sure that you know how to do it, because they can be tricky. Next. I figured we'd have a lot of Phalaenopsis. I'm really pleased that we had some really neat ones this time too. some that we don't see. Phalaenopsis sanderiana is one of the key species in the background of pink phals. But if you see most of the Phalaenopsis sanderiana, you'd see that they're really almost a blush pink. They're very difficult to grow relative to the hybrids. And a lot of people have tried and failed to improve sanderiana to make a dark pink. But this is a good example of sort of one of the darkest that I've seen in a long time. But they also have an interesting characteristic that I think has been brought out in some modern hybrids. Look at the lip. It's almost a solid white. It doesn't have much color on it. And there is a hybrid line of phals that has a solid white lip. And I suspect it probably comes from this particular species. But that's beautiful. Can't tell how many more buds there are, but it looks like it's going to be lasting for quite a while. Sanderiana South Olive. Phalaenopsis Brenda Matthews is just a perfect example of a flower that's pyloric. And look carefully, and you can see that the petals are trying to be a lip. They've got the general shape of the lip and the coloration of the lip. They're not really large, but you get the idea. Not unusual to see them clustered at the end of an inflorescence, because this is a pretty dramatic mutation. But it's a yellow one and really very difficult to find. Some people really love these pyloric things and search far and wide for them. What else we got there, Terry? We got a H.P. Norton, yeah. This is Phalaenopsis H.P. Norton. Some of you probably know who H.P. Norton was. Basically, he was a guy who had a heart attack and was looking for something to do. And his wife had a few orchids, and he became the orchid person. And he dedicated himself to developing yellow Phalaenopsis and red Phalaenopsis. And if you look at modern yellow hybrid Phalaenopsis and red hybrid Phalaenopsis, you will see his work in the background. And this one is called H.P. Norton. It was a cross made by Carl Smith, who was very close to H.P. Norton, and named it after him. And the neat thing is, I suspect, B, you probably got this particular clone from me, because I have a couple of SIB crosses of H.P. Norton. I probably still have 20 of them. And the variation, when you basically take what's in the background and look at how it could come out in a hybrid if you crossed it, so it comes out everything from orange, some of them almost yellow, to blood reds. But
got it from you, Courtney.
Okay, I thought so.
Yep.
And it isn't just that it's red, it's the fact that it's red and has lots of flowers that made his hybrid line so critical. Most of the reds that came before this, they had 1 or 2 flowers on a stem, maybe 3 if you were lucky. But he brought in some characteristics from the large Phalaenopsis into this hybrid line to produce inflorescences that sometimes have 8 or 10 flowers shingled on a stem, just like the big white phals. It's still one of my favorite things, not just because HP did it. He was a friend of mine, just because it's got so much in the background, so much dedicated, so many dedicated hybridizers to make this happen. Next. I call this Phalaenopsis equestris Day, because all 3 of these clones, you can just look at the flower shape and you can make a bet that there's a lot of Phalaenopsis equestris in the background. If you haven't ever paid attention to Phalaenopsis, there are striped Phalaenopsis and there are semi-alba Phalaenopsis, and these are 2 good examples. And both of those characteristics, the striping and the semi-alba characteristic, come from Phalaenopsis equestris, that little tiny thing with lots and lots of flowers. And the one on the right is actually got the mottled foliage, which is really unusual. What is more unusual than the mottled foliage is the fact that it's flowering well. If you have mottled foliage, you don't have as much chlorophyll, and they tend not to flower as well. But even so, there are people who only collect this type of leaf in Phalaenopsis. But the little gem is a really pretty thing. It's just exactly what you would want out of a Phalaenopsis hybrid with lots of equestris in the background. And as I said, It's in the background of almost all semi-albas. And if you look carefully at that, some of the flowers, you can see they've got a little striping in the dorsal sepal. And that's, again, coming from Equestris. Even though Equestris doesn't show it, it's in the background. There you go. Just beautiful. Really nice. Next slide. And here we have some unlabeled Phalaenopsis, and I'd be willing to bet you that several of you now could tell me which ones have Phalaenopsis equestris in it. In fact, the one there up in the middle, J. Fowler's, I wouldn't be surprised if that is Phalaenopsis equestris. If it isn't, it's got a lot of Phalaenopsis equestris in it, because that is exactly what Phalaenopsis equestris looks like. Small flowers, the flowers on the inflorescence, instead of being shingled, they basically are a whorled sort of pattern. And I'll bet that's what that is. On the left is another interesting Phalaenopsis. These don't have labels, but I'll guarantee you that probably has the oddball hybrid that popped up in Taiwan in the background somewhere, just because the color patterns are irregular, and that's a good sign that that's in there somewhere. Golden Piocher is the one. If you've heard the name before, that's the one that causes that. Okay, what else we got? We got a beautiful yellow. I think that you probably could figure out what the name of this hybrid is, just because of the clear yellow and that distinct lip. Now, the only issue is that some of the Taiwanese growers are not registering their hybrids. They're naming them, so you got a name sometimes, but if you go to the RHS, they've never been registered. They're patented, but they're just not registered. One more on there, Terry? Was that it? Oh, there you go. That's a Golden Piocher cross or background for sure. The way those blotches are, that is a characteristic of it. And then the bottom right, that looks like a super duper equestris. But I'm guaranteeing it's a hybrid, but it's just beautiful. Next slide. I'm really glad we had some good Vandas this time. We should be getting some nice Vandas, but the Vanda Fuchs Delight there, bees, that is one of the most magnificent Vandas that I've seen. And I used to see this particular hybrid at RFs all the time. And he had, of course, a lot of really nice clones. But this one here with the cerulean background has always been one of my favorites. And as I recall, there are many color forms of this hybrid, but the cerulean one is striking. And those are large flowers too. They're not little tiny flowers at all. This is a great example of all the variations that pop up, and some of the forms of Vandas too that we don't see. That big round shape on the Vandas comes from Vanda sanderiana, which is really a distinctively different member of the group. Because if you look at the bottom left, Vanda cristata, you can see how different those particular flowers are from this big round form. And in fact, most of the Vandas aren't this big round shape. They're really different shaped and much smaller. What's interesting about Vanda cristata is that it is a species that will hybridize outside of the genus. It hybridizes with Phalaenopsis. It hybridizes with a lot of members of the that are closely related to the Vandaceous group, making it an interesting crossover species. It's probably somewhere in between, but there are characteristics about it that cause taxonomists to put it in the Vanda group. Okay, what else we got there, Terry? Oh yeah, this is my Vanda denisoniana. It's one of my favorite species for a whole lot of reasons. The color, of course, and the flower. It's just a really nice Vanda. And you can see these actually are reasonably round. But one of the other characteristics of it that I really love is the dark orange flowers. Those are older flowers, not falling off. They're older. They're still in the plant right now. And the flowers on the bottom, those are probably the first week after opening. It's yellow. In fact, in the beginning, it's clear yellow, and it slowly gets darker and darker until it becomes this beautiful gold color. There's one thing about these smaller flowered vandas that you ought to pay attention to if you're interested in getting them. Many times you'll see them offered that come from Thailand, and they'll be imported with bare roots. And if you look carefully at the same exact species, you'll often find a clone where you can see it bloomed continuously, not just one spike and then 4 or 5 pairs of leaves, but you'll see a spike in almost every pair of leaves, or even in every leaf itself. Leaf axils, you'll see the dead spike. That's what you look for, because this particular plant will be in flower for me virtually from mid-April, sometimes into September, and even October. And it's hard to find an orchid that will be in bloom so continuously. As long as you keep that sucker growing, about every time he gets a new leaf or a pair of leaves, you'll get a new spike. And that's a characteristic of a lot of the vandas that are of the smaller type. Okay, let's see what else we got there. There's a good example of Dorocentrum pulcherrima. I think that is a species across, let's see, I found that somewhere.
It's pulcherrima with miniatum.
Yeah, that's right. So this is what's now called a phalaenopsis by what used to be called an ascocentrum. And I guess this is, I'm not sure what this is called now, Dorocentrum, maybe, I don't know. I'm sure it's got a good name that will confuse us all. But you see a little bit of the color from the miniatum, and you see the characteristics of actually both of them in the inflorescence. Beautiful little plant. I'm betting that that's going to stay fairly small and probably be pretty vigorous. I'll be surprised if it breeds on, but who would care? It's got such a pretty plant. And the other thing about it, I'm almost guaranteeing you that the Doritis used was one of the clones that has these special markings. Instead of the petals being solid color, they've got these little colors on the inside, up and the bottom, and the top of the petals. And I'm guaranteeing you that was one of the parents. What else, Terry? Oh, there's a beautiful pink. Again, pink flowers, the big pinks are gorgeous, and they're hard to beat. There's one thing about this that I really love because it exemplifies something that most people don't realize. Once you get a vanda flower that's 5 inches across, the vanda flowers tend to droop. The petals tend to droop. Of course, hybridizers don't select those. They select ones that don't droop. But on this particular flower, you can see a characteristic that's usually on the interior structure of a vanda. And that's, see the little ridges? They're like extensions out, and they serve the same thing that some struts on sailboats do to keep that petal flat. And so in some of those big vandas that stay pretty flat, that structure is actually embedded in the petal where you don't see it. But here, it sticks out. It's kind of nice to be able to show someone that characteristic. And it allows the vanda flowers to get huge. And that's, again, a characteristic that comes from the Vanda sandarana. It's that species that contributes the shape, the size, and those stays, I guess they're called, on a sailboat. Now, to the right of that, Ascocenda suksamaran. Again, this looks more like a standard Vanda, but it's got characteristics that come from the Vanda alliance that often are sort of bred away. But the spotting, the striping, I just love this particular one. And I think this is probably more Vanda than Ascocentrum. And now, of course, there is no Ascocentrum. They're all Vandas. So you can legitimately call this a Vanda. That's beautiful. Next slide. Oh, no. Is that all of them on there, Terry? Did I miss one?
You got them.
Okay. Yeah, we got everything. Okay. The Renanthera is a hybrid Renanthera John Loscar, and these are often called dancing ladies. It's still one of my favorite members of the Vandaceous group. They will hybridize with Vandas and just about most of the other Vandaceous orchids. I'm not sure that you get anything by crossing Renanthera with the other members. The charm of this particular group is that those beautiful sepals that stick out, and I guess that's why they're called dancing ladies. Maybe they look like um, legs or flares or something on the clothing. But they're almost all red, yellow with lots of bars. Some people have a hard time growing these. They do like good water, but they especially, like all vandas, like lots of sunshine. So they should be starting to bloom in your greenhouse if you have them. The only downside to this particular group and its hybrids is that many of them have to get pretty large before you see flowers. It's unfortunate that that's the case. There are some hybrids that are fairly small, but if you have one and it's never bloomed, it may be because it's just not mature yet, or you haven't quite given it enough sun. They do like lots of sun, just like the vandas. And Arangus, Hildebrandii, we don't see a lot of Arangus. They're really beautiful, really beautiful. Most of them, most of the species are very similar to this one in that the flowers are small, but lots and lots of flowers. And they have that other characteristic that sort of overcomes the small flowers. They will produce lots and lots of inflorescences at one time. Some of the awards for these Arangus that are similar to this will have 15 or 20 inflorescences on small plants, just like this one. It's hard to beat that characteristic. We just don't see much of this particular kind of Vandaceous orchid. We should. Can't wait to see this one grow up. Vasca stylus. So this has got Rhyncha stylus in the background. This is Vasca stylus, crown fox red gem. And Rhyncha stylus is that species that has these spectacular inflorescences with high flower count. They're white with spots, red, come in a variety of colors. And this is the Rhyncha stylus gigantea in the background, which is one of the reasons you're seeing such a good red color. Hard to beat this. This has got Vanda in the background, so it's Vanda by Rhyncha stylus. Just really nice. What else is there, Terry? That's it, right?
All of it.
Neophonetia falcata, and you can see it just a really nice example of the species. This is Suzanne's to the upper right. Now that I've told you that that's what we're going to be talking about, I will also tell you that this has now been added to the Vanda group. It's Neophonetia is now considered a Vanda. So almost everything in here that we're going to talk about, while it has fancy names, basically they're all Vandas now. So the Nakamotora Newberry apricot. I remember seeing this in the Carter and Holmes nursery. They had seedlings. In fact, I think I've got one of these somewhere growing in my greenhouse. That's Virgil, so that's got a Neophonetia grandparent crossed into the Ascocentrum group of Vandas. You can see the Ascocentrum adds the color, but the one thing about Neophonetia that always comes through is that big nectary. That's that part that sticks out from the back, designed to give moths a little bite of juice every now and then. That one will get really large. It grows lots of kikis at the base, just like the Neophonetia does. And it will produce lots and lots of flowers, particularly as the plant gets bigger. And you can almost lose the plant from your view because it'll have so many flowers. And the thing I will tell you about anything that's got Neophonetia in it is they do not require the high light of the Vandas. And in fact, if you give them too much light, they tend not to flower very well, but it will cause them to grow a lot of those kikis. So finding that perfect place in your greenhouse or growing area for these just might take a little time. But that's perfect color of the leaves there. A nice, good, solid green, not the bright, light green that we see in the Vandas when they're growing well. Okay, what do we have? What else is there, Terry? Okay. What's in the middle? I can't quite read that. Something
Cherry
Carmela.
blossom.
Oh, that's cherry blossom, another Neophonetia hybrid. And again, with all the perfect characteristics, this is an what used to be an Ascocenta crossed onto Neophonetia. And the flower count on these inflorescences is pretty striking. These plants do not get large. And in fact, one of the things that will really make a beautiful specimen plant is as the lead growth gets large, typically there'll be a bunch of new growths after the new growth gets pretty big. And many of the people who grow these well will cut that first one off and then let all those new kikis growing up side branches get about the same size and all flower at the same time and get something spectacular. Cherry blossom is an interesting one in that several of the clones come out different colors. They're not all this particular color. Nice hybrid. Being grown very well, of course, by Linda. Okay, we got some other Neophoenicia guys on here. Yeah. Neophoenicia falcata by Vanda Deninsoniana. You saw Deninsoniana earlier. That was the Vanda I had in there with a big gold yellow. You don't see any of that, do you? It's a characteristic of Deninsoniana that it doesn't really pass on its color. And here Neophoenicia dominates not just for the flower form, but the color too. What's in the bottom right there? Is that more of the?
That's just a blow up of the flower.
Okay. Yeah, the color just disappears. But that is a perfect example though of the nectary. You can really see that stretching out, and that always comes through in the hybrids, even though it may be a little smaller. Next slide. Bulbos. Yeah, these are one that sometimes might be better to see in a photo than to look at really closely because of the fragrance. And I use that fragrance in the broadest sense of the word. The Bulbophyllum claptonensis is really a beautiful thing. And this is being grown well. Big bright green leaves and these striking gold flowers with the stripes. And then the Bulbophyllum graveolens right next to it is maybe a perfect contrast to illustrate the variation that you see in this particular genus. I think there's more forms of flowers in the Bulbophyllum than any other group of orchids. Everything from big single flowers to huge bunches of little flowers all clustered together, giant leaves that get 8 feet long to really tiny things. It's just an amazing genus. And the characteristic of the genus is they all have a cantilever lip. So if you blow on any Bulbophyllum flower, you'll see that the lip wobbles back and forth. It's cantilevered to get insects to land on that lip and to fall into the flower and pollinate it. Beautiful example of in evolution trapping insects in their lovemaking. Okay, next slide. Lycaste nobuo. Leslie's getting better and better at growing these things, and Lycastes are a favorite among a lot of orchid growers. We don't see as many Lycastes here as you would where it's a little cooler. Many of the Lycastes like a little cooler temperatures, but there are a number of species that grow just fine in the heat. The ones that grow well in the heat tend to be yellow, sometimes a little bronzy. There are some magnificent pink Lycastes, and this is one of those groups of orchids where the leaves fall off, and in this case, you can see the new growth coming there. In some of the Lycastes, basically the flowers come out and the flowers are falling off before the new growths come out, and others the new growths are well out. So there's a little variation, but the nice thing about Lycastes that are this type is you can't even see the plant hardly on a well-grown big plant. It's just all flowers when they bloom like this. Just really nice. Next. Pleurophthalus. Every time I see the Pleurophthalus like this, these little small ones, just reminds me of walking through some of the rainforest in the Andes, and big branches that stick out over the walkway, and they'd literally be covered. The entire branch would be covered with little pleurophthalids and similar looking orchids. Sometimes they'd be in flower and you'd have to get your magnifying glass out to see them. But the plants themselves are really beautiful, and this one's being grown really well. I just love the look of that plant. I've had a hard time growing these. They do like really good water because many of them come from mist forests where they get all their water from just the mist that falls on them constantly. Just really, really nice growing plant too. Rachel's doing a really fantastic job with that. The zygolum, which is an interesting hybrid. I really had to look this thing up. It's Zygopetalum by Zygocephalum, two fairly closely related groups. The interesting thing is that hybridizers in Australia have spent a lot of time working on hybrids within the zygo group, producing interesting flowers. Some of them have absolutely amazing fragrances, and they're just different looking than many of the other things we see. It's kind of unfortunate that we don't see as many of this type of hybrid as we would probably like to. It's pretty hard to get things in and out of Australia, and a lot of these hybrids are fairly new, the last 25 years. But a few do make it here, particularly as clones. Next, wait a minute, something else on this thing too. Oh, Spathoglottis. I'm amazed at the fact that Spathoglottis have suddenly become something that hybridizers have been working on, not just for the flowers, flower color, but for their ability to grow outside. I can't remember how long it's been, but it's been a couple of years where I saw a beautiful example of Spathoglottis growing outside in South Florida, not all the way in Homestead, but in Coral Gables, I think it was. And they were using them as a ground cover. And it seemed that they were blooming all the time, just looking at the old inflorescences. And they had many different colors. So Spathoglottis is one of those species that seems to be easily adaptable to growing outside. I've seen them for sale here at the Lowe's too. So they are sold locally. Not sure if they would survive outside. Sue, you may have some, but it'd be something interesting to try if you have some warm spots in your yard under some shade, because they would require some shade.
Definitely.
Beautiful, beautiful plant though. You can see all the buds coming in there. Anything else on that page, Terry?
Nope, that's it. In fact, that's it.
Okay, next
There's one
slide.
more.
Yep.
Somebody's growing these scale really well. And I guess this is the end of my part, but this is the end of Sue's introduction to what's coming up on May the 19th.
Yep. So if you have questions, if you have a problem plan, I think that we'll probably not be muting everybody. It'll be more of a conversation to talk about how you're growing it and what the problem is and what the solution might be. But if you've got a plant that you've got a question about, send the picture over and we'll see if we can have an interactive program. I think we haven't been able to do the ACE repotting for the last 2 months, and we get a lot of people bringing plants by at ACE to talk about it. So if you've got a plant you'd like to talk about or that you've got a question about, send a picture in so we can start the dialogue.